Hi, Happy New Year's, and welcome to my little reading corner where I'm going to be continuing with Brave New World because last stream I started it, but I was dead tired and I only got 2 chapters down. Today I really want to make a lot more progress, but we'll see. It's really late at night where I am, and oh, hi, Orange Cobra. I'm just recapping what I read last time, which was only 2 chapters. My next several reading streams will be Brave New World because this is a damn long novel and I've never read it before. So I hope that you either enjoy the story or get a relaxing sleeping benefit from it. Let's see. So basically, up until now, it's basically just been world building, very, very heavily on the artificial creation, I think, of people. It's been 5 days, so I'm sorry for a very undetailed description, but that's what I remember. And so we're still world building in these first 2 chapters of the book, really. And we heard a lot from the doctors, and we heard about the plans for the future in creating humans from gametes and stuff. A lot of that. I'm sorry. I'm gonna continue before I butcher it. Hopefully it will be refreshed as we begin chapter 3. So I've pinned a message that once I start reading, I don't stop. So if you want to talk about it, I talk about it after. And I'm at the very least gonna attempt another 2 chapters, but I want to do at least 3 chapters. So yeah, I guess settle in and hope you enjoy. All right, let's start at chapter 3. Outside in the garden, it was playtime. Naked in the warm June sunshine, 600 or 700 little boys and girls were running with shrill yells over the lawns, or playing ball games, or squatting silently in 2s and 3s among the flowering shrubs. The roses were in bloom. 2 nightingales soliloquized in the boscage. A cuckoo was just going out of tune among the lime trees. The air was drowsy with the murmur of bees and helicopters. The director and his students stood for a short time watching a game of centrifugal bumble puppy. 20 children were grouped in a circle round a chrome steel tower. A ball thrown up so as to land on the platform as the top of the tower rolled down into the interior, fell on a rapidly revolving disc, was hurled through one or other of the numerous apertures pierced in the cylindrical casing, and had to be caught. Strange, mused the director, as they turned away. Strange to think that even in our Ford's day, most games were played without more apparatus than a ball or two, and a few sticks and perhaps a bit of netting. Imagine the folly of allowing people to play elaborate games which do nothing whatever to increase consumption. It's madness. Nowadays, the controllers won't approve of any new game unless it can be shown that it requires at least as much apparatus as the most complicated of existing games. He interrupted himself. That's a charming little group, he said, pointing. In a little grassy bay between tall clumps of Mediterranean heather, 2 children, a little boy of about 7 and a little girl who might have been a year older, were playing, very gravely and with all the focused attention of scientists intent on a labor of discovery, a rudimentary sexual game. Charming, the DHC repeated sentimentally. Charming, the boys politely agreed, but their smile was rather patronizing. They had put aside similar childish amusements too recently to be able to watch them now without a touch of contempt. Charming, but it was just a pair of kids fooling about. That was all. Just kids. I always think, the director was continuing in the same rather maudlin tone when he was interrupted by a loud boo-hooing. From a neighboring shrubbery emerged a nurse, leading by the hand a small boy, who howled as he went. An anxious-looking little girl trotted at her heels. "What's the matter?" asked the director. The nurse shrugged her shoulders. "Nothing much," she answered. "It's just that this little boy seems rather reluctant to join in the ordinary erotic play. I had noticed it once or twice before, and now again today. He started yelling just now." "Honestly," put in the anxious-looking little girl, "I didn't mean to hurt him or anything, honestly." "Of course you didn't, dear," said the nurse reassuringly. "And so," she went on, turning them back to the director, "I'm taking him in to see the assistant superintendent of psychology, just to see if anything's at all abnormal." "Quite right," said the director. "Take him in. You stay here, little girl," he added as the nurse moved away with her still howling charge. "What's your name?" "Polly Trotsky." "And a very good name, too," said the director. "Run away now and see if you can find some other little boy to play with." The child scampered off into the bushes and was lost to sight. "Exquisite little creature," said the director, looking after her. Then, turning to his students, "What I'm going to tell you now," he said, "may sound incredible. But then, when you're not accustomed to history, most facts about the past do sound incredible." He let out the amazing truth. For a very long period before the time of our Ford, and even for some generations afterward, erotic play between children had been regarded as abnormal. There was a roar of laughter, and not only abnormal, actually immoral. No, and had therefore been rigorously suppressed. A look of astonished incredulity appeared on the faces of his listeners. Poor little kids not allowed to amuse themselves? They could not believe it. Even adolescents, the DHC was saying, even adolescents like yourselves, not possible. Barring a little surreptitious autoerotism and homosexuality, absolutely nothing. Nothing. In most cases, they were over 20 years old. 20 years old, echoed the students in a chorus of loud disbelief. 20, the director repeated. "I told you that you'd find it incredible." "But what happened?" they asked. "What were the results?" The results were terrible. A deep, resonant voice broke startlingly into the dialogue. They looked around. On the fringe of the little group stood a stranger, a man of middle height, black-haired with a hooked nose, full red lips, eyes very piercing and dark. "Terrible," he repeated. The DHC had at that moment sat down on one of the steel and rubber benches conveniently scattered throughout the gardens. But at the sight of the stranger, he sprang to his feet and darted forward, his hands outstretched, smiling with all his teeth, effusive. "Controller, what an unexpected pleasure. Boys, what are you thinking of? This is the controller. This is his Fordship, Mustafa Mond." In the 4,000 rooms of the center, the 4,000 electric clocks simultaneously struck 4. Discarnate voices called from the trumpet mouths. "Main day shift off duty. Second day shift take over. Main day shift off." In the lift on their way up to the changing rooms, Henry Foster and the assistant director of predestination rather pointedly turned their backs on Bernard Marx from the psychology bureau, averted themselves from that unsavory reputation. The faint hum and rattle of machinery still stirred the crimson air in the embryo store. Shifts might come and go, one lupus-colored face give place to another. Majestically and forever the conveyors crept forward with their load of future men and women. Lenina Crown walked briskly towards the door. His forwardship Mustafa Mond. The eyes of the saluting students almost popped out of their heads. Mustafa Mond, the resident controller for Western Europe. One of the 10 world controllers. One of the 10. And he sat down on the bench with the DHC. He was going to stay, yes, and actually talk to them. Straight from the horse's mouth. Straight from the mouth of Ford himself. 2 shrimp-brown children emerged from a neighboring shrubbery, stared at them for a moment with large, astonished eyes, then returned to their amusements among the leaves. "You all remember," said the controller in his strong, deep voice. "You all remember, I suppose, that beautiful and inspired saying of our Fords, 'History is bunk.' History," he repeated slowly, "is bunk." He waved his hand, and it was as though, with an invisible feather whisk, he had brushed away a little dust, and the dust was Harappa, was Ur of the Chaldees, some spider webs, and they were Thebes and Babylon, and Knossos and Mycenae. Whisk, whisk, and where was Odysseus? Where was the Job? Where was Jupiter and Gautama and Jesus? Whisk, and those specks of antique dirt called Athens and Rome, Jerusalem and the Middle Kingdom, all were gone. Whisk, the place where Italy had been was empty. Whisk, the cathedrals, whisk, whisk, King Lear and the thoughts of Pascal. Whisk, passion, whisk, requiem, whisk, symphony, whisk. "Going to the Feelies this evening, Henry?" inquired the assistant predestinator. "I hear the new one at the Alhambra is first rate. There's a love scene on bearskin rug. They say it's marvelous. Every hair of the bear reproduced, the most amazing tactual effects." "That's why you're taught no history," the controller was saying. "But now the time has come." The DHC looked at him nervously. There were those strange rumors of old forbidden books hidden in a safe in the controller's study. Bibles, poetry. Ford knew that. Mustafa Mond intercepted his anxious glance, and the corners of his red lips twitched ironically. "It's all right, Director," he said in a tone of faint derision. "I won't corrupt them." The DHC was overwhelmed with confusion. Those who feel themselves despised do well to look despising. The smile on Bernard Mark's face was contemptuous. Every hair on the bear indeed. "I shall make a point of going," said Henry Foster. Mustafa Mond leaned forward, shook a finger at them. "Just try to realize it," he said, and his voice sent a strange thrill quivering along their diaphragms. "Try to realize what it was like to have a viviparous mother." That smutty word again. But none of them dreamed this time of smiling. Try to imagine what living with one's family meant. They tried, but obviously without the smallest success. "And do you know what a home was?" They shook their heads. From her dim crimson cellar, Lenina Crown shot up 17 stories, turned to the right as she stepped out of the lift, walked down a long corridor, and, opening the door marked "Girls' Dressing Room," plunged into deafening chaos of arms and bosoms and underclothing. Torrents of hot water were splashing into or gurgling out of 100 baths, rumbling and hissing. 80 vibro-vacuum massage machines were simultaneously kneading and sucking the firm and sunburnt flesh of 80 superb female specimens. Everyone was talking at the top of her voice, and a synthetic music machine was warbling out a super cornet solo. "Hello, Fanny," said Lenina to the young woman who had the pegs and locker next to hers. Fanny worked in the bottling room, and her surname was also Crown. But as the 2,000 million inhabitants of the planet had only 10,000 names between them, the coincidence was not particularly surprising. Lenina pulled at her zippers, downwards on the jacket, downwards with a double-handed gesture at the two that held trousers, downwards again to loosen her undergarment. Still wearing her shoes and stockings, she walked off towards the bathrooms. Home. A few small rooms, stiflingly over-inhabited by a man, by a periodically teeming woman, by a rabble of boys and girls of all ages. No air, no space, an under-sterilized prison, darkness, disease, and smells. The controller's evocation was so vivid that one of the boys, more sensitive than the rest, turned pale at the mere description and was on the point of being sick. Lenina got out of the bath, toweled herself dry, took hold of a long flexible tube plugged into the wall, presented the nozzle to her breast as though she meant to commit unalive, pressed down the trigger. A blast of warmed air dusted her with the finest talcum powder. 8 different scents and eau de cologne were laid on in little taps over the wash basin. She turned on the third from the left, dabbled herself with chyper, and carried her shoes and stockings in her hand, went out to see if one of the vibro vacuum machines were free. And home was as squalid psychically as physically. Psychically, it was a rabbit hole, a midden, hot with the frictions of tightly packed life, reeking with emotion. What suffocating intimacies, what dangerous, insane, obscene relationships between the members of the family group. Maniacally, the mother brooded over her children, brooded over them like a cat over its kittens, but a cat that could talk, a cat that could say, my baby, over and over again. My baby, and oh, at my breast, the little hands, the hunger, and that unspeakable, agonizing pleasure. Till at last my baby sleeps with a bubble of white milk at the corner of his mouth. My little baby sleeps. Yes, said Mustafa Mon, nodding his head. You may well shudder. Who are you going out with tonight? Lenina asked, returning from the vibrovac like a pearl illuminated from within, pinkly glowing. Nobody. Lenina raised her eyebrows in astonishment. I've been feeling rather out of sorts lately, Fanny explained. Dr. Wells advised me to have a pregnancy substitute. But my dear, you're only 19. The first pregnancy substitute isn't compulsory till 21. I know, dear, but some people are better if they begin earlier. Dr. Wells told me that brunettes with wide pelvises like me ought to have their first pregnancy substitute at 17. So I'm really 2 years late, not 2 years early. She opened the door of her locker and pointed to the row of boxes labeled files on the upper shelf. Syrup of Corpus Luteum. Lenina read the names aloud. Overin, guaranteed fresh, not to be used after August 1st, AF 632. Mammary gland extract, to be taken 3 times daily, before meals with a little water. Placentin, 5 cc's to be injected intravenously every 3rd day. Ugh, Lenina shuddered. How I loathe intravenals, don't you? Yes, but when they do one good. Fanny was a particularly sensible girl. Our Ford, or our Freud, as for some inscrutable reason he chose to call himself whenever he spoke of psychological matters, our Freud had been the first to reveal the appalling dangers of family life. The world was full of fathers, was therefore full of misery, full of mothers, therefore of every kind of perversion from sadism to chastity, full of brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, full of madness and suicide. And yet among the savages of Samoa and certain islands off the coast of New Guinea, The tropical sunshine lay like warm honey on the naked bodies of children tumbling promiscuously among the hibiscus blossoms. Home was in any one of 20 palm-thatched houses. In the Trobriand's conception was the work of ancestral ghosts. Nobody had ever heard of a father. Extremes, said the controller, meet, for the good reason that they were made to meet. Dr. Wells said that at 3 months, pregnancy substitute will make all the difference to my health for the next 3 or 4 years. Well, I hope he's right, said Lenina. But Fanny, do you really mean to say that for the next 3 months you're not supposed to? Oh, no, dear. Only for a week or two, that's all. I shall spend this evening at the club playing musical bridge. I suppose you're going out? Lenina nodded. Who with? Henry Foster. Again. Fanny's kind, rather moon-like face took on an incongruous expression of pained and disapproving astonishment. Do you mean to tell me you're still going out with Henry Foster? Mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters. But there were also husbands, wives, lovers. There were also monogamy and romance. Though you probably don't know what those are, said Mustafa Mond. They shook their heads. Family, monogamy, romance. Everywhere exclusiveness, everywhere a focusing of interest, a narrow channeling of impulse and energy. But everyone belongs to everyone else, he concluded, citing the hypnopathic proverb. The students nodded, emphatically agreeing with the statement which upwards of 62,000 repetitions in the dark had made them accept, not merely as true, but as axiomatic, self-evident, and utterly indisputable. But after all, Lenina was protesting, it's only about 4 months now since I've been having Henry. Only 4 months? I like that. And what's more, Fanny went on, pointing an accusing finger, there's been nobody else except Henry all that time, has there? Lenina blushed scarlet, but her eyes, the tone of her voice remained defiant. No, there hasn't been anyone else, she answered almost truculently. And I jolly don't well see why there should have been. Oh, she jolly well doesn't see why there should have been, Fanny repeated, as though to an invisible listener behind Lenina's left shoulder. Then, with a sudden change of tone, but seriously, she said, I really do think you ought to be careful. It's such horribly bad form to go on and on like this with one man. At 40 or 35, it wouldn't be so bad. But at your age, Lenina? No, it really won't do. And you know how strongly the DHC objects to anything intense or long drawn? 4 months of Henry Foster, without having another man? Why, he'd be furious if he knew. Think of water under a pressure in a pipe. They thought of it. I pierced it once, said the controller. What a jet. He pierced it 20 times. There were 20 piddling little fountains. My baby, my baby. Mother, the madness is infectious. My love, my one and only, precious, precious. Mother, monogamy, romance. High spurts the fountain, fierce and foamy the wild jet. The urge has but a single outlet. My love, my baby. No wonder those poor pre-moderns were mad and wicked and miserable. Their world didn't allow them to take things easily. Didn't allow them to be sane, virtuous, happy. What with mothers and lovers? What with the prohibitions they were not conditioned to obey? What with the temptations and lonely remorses? What with all the diseases and the endless isolating pain? What with the uncertainties and the poverty they were forced to feel strongly? And feeling strongly, and strongly what was more in solitude and hopelessly individual isolation, how could they be stable? Of course, there's no need to give him up. Have somebody else from time to time, that's all. He has other girls, doesn't he? Lenina admitted it. Of course he does. Trust Henry Foster to be the perfect gentleman, always correct. And then there's the director to think of. You know what a stickler. Nodding, he patted me on the behind this afternoon, said Lenina. There, you see? Fanny was triumphant. That shows what he stands for, the strictest conventionality. Stability, said the controller. Stability. No civilization without social stability. No social stability without individual stability. His voice was a trumpet. Listening, they felt larger, warmer. The machine turns, turns, and must keep on turning, forever. It is death if it stands still. 1,000 millions scrabbled the crust of the earth. The wheels began to turn. In 150 years, there were 2,000 millions. Stop all the wheels. In 150 weeks, there are once more only 1,000 millions. 1,000 men and women have starved to death. Wheels must turn steadily, but cannot turn untended. There must be men to tend them, men as steady as the wheels upon their axles, sane men, obedient men, stable in contentment, crying, my baby, my mother, my only love, groaning, my sin, my terrible God, screaming with pain, muttering with fever, bemoaning old age and poverty. How can they tend the wheels? And if they cannot tend the wheels, the corpses of 1,000 men and women would be hard to bury or burn. And after all, Fanny's tone was coaxing. It's not as though there were anything painful or disagreeable about having 1 or 2 men besides Henry. And seeing that, you ought to be a little more promiscuous. Stability, insisted the controller. Stability. The primal and the ultimate need. Stability. Hence all this. With a wave of his hand, he indicated the gardens, the huge building of the conditioning center, the naked children furtive in the undergrowth or running across the lawns. Lenina shook her head. Somehow, she mused, I hadn't been feeling very keen on promiscuity lately. There are times when one doesn't. Haven't you found that too, Fanny? Fanny nodded her sympathy and understanding. But one's got to make the effort, she said sententiously. One's got to play the game. After all, everyone belongs to everyone else. Yes, everyone belongs to everyone else, Lenina repeated slowly, and, sighing, was silent for a moment. Then, taking Fanny's hand, gave it a little squeeze. You're quite right, Fanny, as usual. I'll make the effort. Impulse arrested spills over, and the flood is feeling, the flood is passion, the flood is even madness. It depends on the force of the current, the height and the strength of the barrier. The unchecked stream flows smoothly down its appointed channels into a calm well-being. The embryo is hungry, day in, day out. The blood surrogate pump unceasingly turns its 800 revolutions a minute. The decanted infant howls. At once a nurse appears with a bottle of external secretion. Feeling lurks in that interval of time between desire and its consummation. Shorten that interval. Break down all those old unnecessary barriers. Fortunate boys, said the controller. No pains have been spared to make your lives emotionally easy, to preserve you, so far as that is possible, from having emotions at all. Ford's in his flivver, murmured the DHC. All's well in the world. Lenina Crown, said Henry Foster, echoing the assistant predestinator's question as he zipped up his trousers. Oh, she's a splendid girl. Wonderfully pneumatic. I'm surprised you haven't met her. You haven't had her. I can't think how it is how I haven't, said the assistant predestinator. I certainly will. at the first opportunity. From his place on the opposite side of the changing room aisle, Bernard Marx overheard what they were saying and turned pale. "And to tell the truth," said Lenina, "I'm beginning to get just a tiny bit bored with nothing but Henry every day." She pulled on her left stocking. "Do you know Bernard Marx?" she asked in a tone whose excessive casualness was evidently forced. Fanny looked startled. "You don't mean to say—" "Why not? Bernard's an Alpha Plus. Besides, he asked me to go to one of the Savage reservations with him. I've always wanted to see a Savage reservation. But his reputation— what do I care about his reputation? They say he doesn't like obstacle golf." They say, mocked Lenina. "And then he spends most of his time by himself, alone." There was horror in Fanny's voice. "Well, he won't be alone when he's with me. And anyhow, why are people so beastly to him? I think he's rather sweet." She smiled to herself. How absurdly shy he had been, frightened almost, as though she were a world controller and he a gamma-minus machine minder. "Consider your own lives," said Mustafa Mond. "Has any of you ever encountered an insurmountable obstacle?" The question was answered by a negative silence. "Has any of you been compelled to live through a long time interval between the consciousness of a desire and its fulfillment?" "Well," began one of the boys, and hesitated. "Speak up," said the DHC. "Don't keep his Fordship waiting." "I once had to wait nearly 4 weeks before a girl I wanted would let me have her." "And you felt a strong emotion in consequence?" "Horrible." "Horrible, precisely," said the controller. "Our ancestors were so stupid and short-sighted that when the first reformers came along and offered to deliver them from those horrible emotions, they wouldn't have anything to do with them." "Talking about her as though she were a bit of meat," Bernard ground his teeth. "Have her here, have her there, like mutton, disregarding her to so much mutton. She said she'd think it over. She said she'd give me an answer this week. Oh, Ford. He would have liked to go up to them and hit them in the face, hard, again and again. Yes, I really do advise you to try her," Henry Foster was saying. "Take ectogenesis. Fitzner and Kawaguchi had got the whole technique worked out. But would the governments look at it? No. There was something called Christianity. Women were forced to go on being viviparous." "He's so ugly," said Fanny. "But I rather like his looks. And then so small." Fanny made a grimace. Smallness was so horribly and typically low caste. "I think that's rather sweet," said Lenina. "One feels like one would like to pet him, you know, like a cat." Fanny was shocked. "They say somebody made a mistake when he was still in the bottle. Thought he was a gamma and put alcohol into his blood surrogate. That's why he's so stunted." "What nonsense!" Lenina was indignant. Sleep teaching was actually prohibited in England. There was something called liberalism. Parliament, if you know what that was, passed a law against it. The records survive. Speeches about liberty of the subject. Liberty to be inefficient and miserable. Freedom to be a round peg in a square hole. But my dear chap, you're welcome, I assure you, you're welcome. Henry Foster patted the assistant predestinator on the shoulder. Everyone belongs to everyone else, after all. 100 repetitions 3 nights a week for 4 years, thought Bernard Marx, who was a specialist on hypnopadia. 62,400 repetitions make one truth. Idiots. Or the caste system. Constantly proposed, constantly rejected. There was something called democracy, as though men were more than physico-chemically equal. Well, all I can say is that I'm going to accept his invitation. Bernard hated them, but they were two. They were large, they were strong. The 9 Years' War began in AF 141. Not even if it were true about the alcohol in his blood surrogate. Phosgene, chloropycerin, ethyl iodicetate, diphencylicerine, trichloromethyl, chlorophomate, dichlorethyl sulfide, not to mention hydrocyanic acid, which I simply don't believe, Lenina concluded. The noise of 14,000 aeroplanes advancing in open order, but in the Kurfürstendamm and the 8th arrondissement, the explosion of the anthrax bombs is hardly louder than the popping of a paper bag. Because I do want to see a savage reservation. CH3 C6H2 NO2 3HG CNO2 equals, well, what? An enormous hole in the ground, a pile of masonry, some bits of flesh and mucus, a foot with the boot still on it, flying through the air and landing, flop, in the middle of the geraniums, the scarlet ones. Such a splendid show that summer. You're hopeless, Lenina. I give you up. The Russian technique for infecting water supplies was particularly ingenious. Back turned to back, Fanny and Lenina continued their changing in silence. The 9 Years' War, the great economic collapse. There was a choice between world control and destruction, between stability and... Fanny's crown's a nice girl, too, said the assistant predestinator. In the nurseries, the elementary class consciousness lesson was over. The voices were adapting future demand to future industrial supply. I do love flying, they whispered. I do love flying. I do love having new clothes. I do love... Liberalism, of course, was dead of anthrax, but all the same you couldn't do things by force. Not nearly so nomadic as Lenina. Oh, not nearly. But old clothes are beastly, continued the untiring whisper. We always throw away old clothes. Ending is better than mending. Ending is better than mending. Ending is better. Small note, these are all separate conversations, and it's hard to distinguish that when I'm reading, but I'm trying. Government's an affair of sitting, not hitting. You rule with the brains and the buttocks, never with the fists. For example, there was the conscription of consumption. There, I'm ready, said Lenina, but Fanny remained speechless and averted. Let's make peace, Fanny, darling. Every man, woman, and child compelled to consume so much a year. In the interests of industry. The sole result. Ending is better than mending. The more stitches, the less riches. The more stitches. One of these days, said Fanny, with dismal emphasis, you'll get into trouble. Conscientious objection on an enormous scale. Anything not to consume, back to nature. I do love flying. I do love flying. Back to culture. Yes, actually to culture. You can't consume much if you sit still and read books. Do I look all right? Lenina asked. Her jacket was made of bottle green acetate cloth with green viscose fur at the cuffs and collar. 800 simple lifers were mowed down by machine guns at Golders Green. Ending is better than mending. Ending is better than mending. Green corduroy shorts and white viscose woolen stockings turned down below the knee. Then came the famous British Museum massacre. 2,000 culture fans gassed with dichlorethyl sulfide. A green and white jockey cap shaded Lenina's eyes. Her shoes were bright green and highly polished. In the end, said Mustafa Mond, the controllers realized that force was no good. The slower but infinitely surer method of ectogenesis, neo-Pavlovian conditioning, and hypnopaedia. and round her waist she wore a silver-mounted green Morocco surrogate cartridge belt, bulging, for Lennon it was not a free Martin, with the regulation supply of contraceptives. The discoveries of Fitzner and Kawaguchi were at last made use of, an intensive propaganda against viviparous reproduction. Perfect, cried Fanny enthusiastically. She could never resist Lenina's charm for long. And what a perfectly sweet Malthusian belt! Accompanied by a campaign against the past, by the closing of museums, the blowing up of historical monuments, luckily most of them had already been destroyed during the 9 Years' War, by the suppression of all books published before AF 150. I simply must get one like it, said Fanny. There were some things called the pyramids, for examples. My old black patent bandolier, and a man called Shakespeare. You've never heard of them, of course. It's an absolute disgrace, that bandolier of mine. Such are the advantages of a really scientific education. The more stitches, the less riches. The more stitches, the less. The introduction of our Ford's first T model. I've had it nearly 3 months. Chosen as the opening date of the new era. Ending is better than mending. Ending is better. There was a thing, as I've said before, called Christianity. Ending is better than mending. The ethics and philosophy of underconsumption. I love new clothes. I love new clothes. I love... So essential when there was underproduction, but in an age of machines and the fixation of nitrogen, positively a crime against society. Henry Foster gave it to me. All crosses had their tops cut and became T's. There was also a thing called God. It's real Morocco surrogate. We have the world state now, and Ford's Day celebrations and the community sings, and solidarity services. Ford, how I hate them, Bernard Marx was thinking. There was a thing called heaven, but all the same they used to drink enormous quantities of alcohol. Like meat, like so much meat. There was a thing called the soul and a thing called our immortality. Do ask Henry where he got it. But they used to make morphia and cocaine. And what makes it worse, she thinks of herself as meat. 2,000 pharmacologists and biochemists were subsidized in AF 178. He does look glum, said the assistant predestinator, pointing at Bernard Marx. 6 years later, it was being produced commercially. The perfect drug. Let's bait him. Euphoric, narcotic, pleasantly hallucinant. Glum, Marx, glum. The clap on the shoulder made him start, look up. It was that brute Henry Foster. What you need is a gram of soma. All the advantages of Christianity and alcohol, none of their defects. Ford, I should like to kill him. But all he did was to say, no thank you, and fend off the proffered tube of tablets. Take a holiday from reality whenever you like, and come back without so much as a headache of a mythology. Take it, insisted Henry Foster, take it. Stability was practically assured. 1 cubic centimeter cures 10 gloomy sentiments, said the assistant predestinator, citing a piece of homely hypnopathic wisdom. It only remained to conquer old age. Damn you, shouted Bernard Marx. Hoity-toity. Gonadal hormones, transfusion of young blood, magnesium salts. And do remember that a gram is better than a dam. They went out laughing. All the physiological stigmata of old age have been abolished, and along with them, of course. Don't forget to ask him about that Malthusian belt, said Fanny. Along with them all the old man's mental peculiarities. Characters remain constant throughout a whole lifetime. 2 rounds of obstacle golf to get through before dark. I must fly. Work, play at 60-hour powers, and taste were what they were at 17. Old men in the bad old days used to renounce, retire, take to religion, spend their time reading, thinking. Idiots, swine, Bernard Marx was saying to himself as he walked down the corridor to the lift. Now, such is progress. The old men work, the old men copulate, the old men have no time, no leisure from pleasure, not a moment to sit down and think, or if ever by some unlucky chance such a crevice of time should yawn in the solid substance of their distractions, there is always soma, delicious soma, Half a gram for half a holiday, a gram for a weekend, 2 grams for a trip to the gorgeous east, 3 for a dark eternity on the moon, returning whence they find themselves on the other side of the crevice, safe on the solid ground of daily labor and distraction, scampering from feely to feely, from girl to pneumatic girl, from electromagnetic golf course to— "Go away, little girl," shouted the DHC angrily. "Go away, little boy. Can't you see that this Ford ship's busy? Go and do your erotic play somewhere else." "Poor little children," said the controller. Slowly, majestically, with a faint humming of machinery, the conveyors moved forward, 33 centimeters an hour. In the red darkness glinted innumerable rubies. Chapter 4. The lift was crowded with men from the Alpha changing rooms, and Lenina's entry was greeted by many friendly nods and smiles. She was a popular girl, at one time or another, had spent a night with almost all of them. They were dear boys, she thought, as she returned their salutations. Charming boys. Still, she did wish that George Edsel's ears weren't quite so big. Perhaps he'd been given just a spot too much parathyroid at meter 328. And looking at Benito Hoover, she couldn't help remembering that he was really too hairy when he took his clothes off. Turning, with eyes a little saddened by the recollection of Benito's curly blackness, she saw in a corner the small, thin body, the melancholy face of Bernard Marx. "Bernard!" She stepped up to him. "I was looking for you." Her voice rang clear above the hum of the mounting lift. The others looked around curiously. "I wanted to talk to you about our New Mexico plan." Out of the tail of her eye, she could see Benito Hoover gaping with astonishment. The gape annoyed her. "Surprised I shouldn't be begging to go with him again," she said to herself. Then aloud, and more warmly than ever, "I'd simply love to come with you for a week in July," she went on. Anyhow, she was publicly proving her unfaithfulness to Henry. Fanny ought to be pleased, even though it was Bernard. That is, Lenina gave him her most deliciously significant smile. "If you still want to have me." Bernard's pale face flushed. What on earth for? She wondered, astonished, but at the same time touched by this strange tribute to her power. "Hadn't we better talk about it somewhere else?" he stammered, looking horribly uncomfortable. As though I'd been saying something shocking, thought Lenina. He couldn't look more upset if I'd made a dirty joke, asked him who his mother was or something like that. I mean, with all these people about. He was choked with confusion. Lenina's laugh was frank and wholly unmalicious. "How funny you are," she said, and she quite genuinely did think him funny. "You'll give me at least a week's warning, won't you?" she went on in another tone. "I suppose we take the Blue Pacific rocket? Does it start from the Charing T Tower, or is it from Hampstead?" Before Bernard could answer, the lift came to a standstill. "Roof," called a creaking voice. The liftman was a small simian creature, dressed in the black tunic of an epsilon- semi-moron. "Roof." He flung open the gates. The warm glory of afternoon sunlight made him start and blink his eyes. "Oh, Roof," he repeated in a voice of rapture. He was as though suddenly and joyfully awakened from a dark, annihilating stupor. "Roof." He smiled up with a kind of doggedly expectant adoration into the faces of his passengers. Talking and laughing together, they stepped out into the light. The liftman looked after them. "Roof?" he said once more, questioningly. Then a bell rang, and from the ceiling of the lift, a loudspeaker began. very softly and yet very imperiously, to issue its commands. "Go down," it said. "Go down. Floor 18, go down, go down. Floor 18, go down, go." The liftman slammed the gates, touched a button, and instantly dropped back into the droning twilight of the well, the twilight of his own habitual stupor. It was warm and bright on the roof. The summer afternoon was drowsy with the hum of passing helicopters, and the deeper drone of the rocket planes hastening, invisible, through the bright sky 5 or 6 miles overhead was like a caress on the soft air. Bernard Marks drew a deep breath. He looked up into the sky and round the blue horizon, and finally down into Lena's face. "Isn't it beautiful?" His voice trembled a little. She smiled at him with an expression of the most sympathetic understanding. "Simply perfect for obstacle golf," she answered rapturously. "And now I must fly, Bernard. Henry gets cross if I keep him waiting. Let me know in good time about the date." And, waving her hand, she ran away across the wide flat roof towards the hangars. Bernard stood watching the retreating twinkle of the white stockings, the sunburnt knees vivaciously bending and unbending again, and the softer rolling of those well-fitted corduroy shorts beneath the bottle green jacket. His face wore an expression of pain. "I should say she was pretty," said a loud and cheery voice just behind him. Bernard started and looked around. The chubby red face of Benito Hoover was beaming down at him, beaming with manifest cordiality. Benito was notoriously good-natured. People said of him that he could have got through life without ever touching Soma. The malice and bad tempers from which other people had to take holidays never afflicted him. Reality for Benito was always sunny. Pneumatic too, and how? Then, in another tone, "But, I say," he went on, "you do look glum. What you need is a gram of Soma." Diving into his right-hand trouser pocket, Benito produced a phial. 1 cubic centimeter cures 10 gloomy. But, I say. Bernard had suddenly turned and rushed away. Benito started after him. What can be the matter with the fellow? He wondered, and shaking his head, decided that the story about the alcohol having been put into the poor chap's blood surrogate must be true. Touched his brain, I suppose. He put away the Soma bottle, and, taking out a packet of sex hormone chewing gum, stuffed a plug into his cheek and walked slowly away towards the hangars, ruminating. Henry Foster had had his machine wheeled out of its lockup, and, when Lena arrived, was already seated in the cockpit, waiting. 4 minutes late, was all his comment, as she climbed in beside him. He started the engines and threw the helicopter screws into gear. The machine shot vertically into the air. Henry accelerated. The humming of the propellers shrilled from hornet to wasp, from wasp to mosquito. The speedometer showed that they were rising at the best part of 2 kilometers a minute. London diminished beneath them. The huge table-topped buildings were no more, in a few seconds, than a bed of geometrical mushrooms sprouting from the green of park and garden. In the midst of them, thin-stalked, a taller, slenderer fungus. The Charity Tower lifted towards the sky a disk of shining concrete. Like the vague torsos of fabulous athletes, huge fleshy clouds lolled on the blue air above their heads. Out of one of them suddenly dropped a small scarlet insect, buzzing as it fell. "There's the red rocket," said Henry, "just come in from New York." Looking at his watch, 7 minutes behind time, he added, and shook his head. These Atlantic services, they're really scandalously unpunctual. He took his foot off the accelerator. The humming of the screws overhead dropped an octave and a half, back through wasp and hornet to bumblebee, to cockchafer to stag beetle. The upward rush of the machine slackened off. A moment later, they were hanging motionless in the air. Henry pushed at the lever. There was a click. Slowly at first, then faster and faster, till it was a circular mist before their eyes. The propeller in front of them began to revolve. The wind of a horizontal speed whistled ever more shrilly in the stays. Henry kept his eyes on the revolution counter. When the needle touched the 1200 mark, he threw the helicopter screws out of gear. The machine had had enough forward momentum to be able to fly on its planes. Lenina looked down through the window in the floor between her feet. They were flying over the 6-kilometer zone of parkland that separated central London from its first ring of satellite suburbs. The green was maggoty with foreshortened life. Forests of centrifugal bumblepuppy towers gleamed between the trees. Near Shepherd's Bush, 2,000 beta-minus mixed doubles were playing Ryman surf tennis. A double row of escalator 5 courts lined the main road from Notting Hill to Willesden. In the Ealing Stadium, a Delta gymnastic display and community sing was in progress. "What a hideous color khaki is," remarked Lenina, voicing the hypnopathic prejudices of her caste. The buildings of the Hounslow Feely studio covered 7.5 hectares. Near them, a black and khaki army of laborers was busy revitrifying the surface of the Great West Road. One of the huge traveling crucibles was being tapped as they flew over. The molten stone poured out in a stream of dazzling incandescence across the road. The asbestos rollers came and went. At the tail of an insulated watering cart, the steam rose in white clouds. At Brentford, the television corporation's factory was like a small town. "They must be changing the shift," said Lenina. Like aphides and ants, the leaf-green gamma girls, the black semi-morons, swarmed around the entrances or stood in queues to take their places in the monorail tram cars. Mulberry-colored beta-minuses came and went among the crowd. The roof of the main building was alive with the alighting and departure of helicopters. "My word," said Lenina. "I'm glad I'm not a gamma." 10 minutes later, they were at Stoke Poges and had started their first round of obstacle golf. With eyes for the most part downcast, and if they ever lighted on a fellow creature, at once and furtively averted, Bernard hastened across the roof. He was like a man pursued, but pursued by enemies he does not wish to see, lest they should seem more hostile even than he had supposed, and he himself be made to feel guiltier and even more helplessly alone. That horrible Benito Hoover! And yet the man had meant well enough, which only made it, in a way, much worse. Those who meant well behaved in the same way as those who meant badly. Even Lenina was making him suffer. He remembered those weeks of timid indecision, during which he had looked and longed and despaired of ever having the courage to ask her. Dare he face the risk of being humiliated by a contemptuous refusal? But if she were to say yes, what rapture! Well, now she had said it, and he was still wretched that she had thought to such a perfect afternoon for obstacle golf, that she should have trotted away to join Henry Foster, that she should have found him funny for not wanting to talk of their most private affairs in public. Wretched, in a word, because she had behaved as any healthy and virtuous English girl ought to behave, and not in some other abnormal, extraordinary way. He opened the door of his lockup and called to a lounging couple of Delta Minus attendants to come and push his machine out on the roof. The hangars were staffed by a single Bokanovsky group, and the men were twins, identically small, black and hideous. Bernard gave his orders in the sharp, rather arrogant, and even offensive tone of one who does not feel himself too secure in his superiority. To have dealings with members of the lower caste was always, for Bernard, a most distressing experience. For whatever the cause, and the current gossip about the alcohol in his blood surrogate may very likely, for accidents will happen, have been true, Bernard's physique was hardly better than that of the average gamma. He stood 8 centimeters short of the standard alpha height and was slender in proportion. Contrast with members of the lower castes always reminded him painfully of his physical inadequacy. I am I, and I wish I wasn't. His self-consciousness was acute and distressing. Each time he found himself looking on the level, instead of downward, into a delta's face, he felt humiliated. Would the creature treat him with the respect due to his caste? The question haunted him, not without reason, for gammas, deltas, and epsilons had been to some extent conditioned to associate corporeal mass with social superiority. Indeed, a faint hypnopathic prejudice in favor of size was universal. Hence the laughter of the woman to whom he made proposals, the practical joking of his equals among the men. The mockery made him feel like an outsider, and feeling an outsider, he behaved like one, which increased the prejudice against him and intensified the contempt and hostility aroused by his physical defects, which in turn increased his sense of being alien and alone. A chronic fear of being slighted made him avoid his equals, made him stand, where his inferiors were concerned, self-consciously on his dignity. How bitterly he had envied men like Henry Foster and Benito Hoover, men who had never had to shout at an epsilon to get an order obeyed, men who took their position for granted, men who moved through the caste system as a fish through the water, so utterly at home as to be unaware either of themselves or of the beneficent and comfortable element in which they had their being. Slackly, it seemed to him, and with reluctance, the twin attendants wheeled his plane out on the roof. "Hurry up," said Bernard irritably. One of them glanced at him. Was that a kind of bestial derision that he detected in those blank gray eyes? "Hurry up," he shouted more loudly, and there was an ugly rasp in his voice. He climbed into the plane and, a minute later, was flying southwards towards the river. The various Bureau of Propaganda and the College of Emotional Engineering were housed in a single 60-story building in Fleet Street. In the basement and on the lower level floors were the presses and offices of the 3 great London newspapers, the Hourly Radio, an upper caste sheet, the pale green Gamma Gazette, and, on khaki paper, and in words exclusively of one syllable, the Delta Mirror. Then came the Bureau of Propaganda by television, by feeling picture, and by synthetic voice and music respectively, 22 floors of them. Above were the research laboratories and the padded rooms in which the soundtrack writers and synthetic composers did their delicate work. The top 18 floors were occupied by the College of Emotional Engineering. Bernard landed on the roof of Propaganda House and stepped out. "Ring down to Mr. Helmholtz Watson," he ordered the Gamma Plus porter, "and tell him that Mr. Bernard Marx is waiting for him on the roof." He sat down and lit a cigarette. Helmholtz Watson was writing when the message came down. "Tell him I'm coming at once," he said, and hung up the receiver. Then, turning to his secretary, "I'll leave you to put my things away," he went on in the same official and impersonal tone, and, ignoring her lustrous smile, got up and walked briskly to the door. He was a powerfully built man, deep-chested, broad-shouldered, massive, and yet quick in his movements, springy and agile. The round, strong pillar of his neck supported a beautifully shaped head. His hair was dark and curly, his features strongly marked. In a forcible, emphatic way, he was handsome and looked, as his secretary was never tired of repeating, every centimeter an alpha plus. By profession, he was a lecturer at the College of Emotional Engineering, Department of Writing, and in the intervals of his educational activities, a working emotional engineer. He wrote regularly for the hourly radio, composed feely scenarios, and had the happiest knack for slogans and hypnopaetic rhymes. Able was the verdict of his superiors, perhaps, and they would shake their heads, would significantly lower their voices. A little too able. Yes, a little too able, they were right. Mental excess had produced in Helmholtz Watson effects very similar to those which, in Bernard Marx, were the result of a physical defect. Too little bone and brawn had isolated Bernard from his fellow men, and the sense of this apartness being, by all the current standards, a mental excess, became in its turn a cause of wider separation. That which had made Helmholtz so uncomfortably aware of being himself and all alone was too much ability. What the two men shared was the knowledge that they were individuals. But whereas the physically defective Bernard had suffered all his life from the consciousness of being separate, it was only quite recently that, grown aware of his mental excess, Helmholtz Watson had also become aware of his difference from the people who had surrounded him. This escalator squash champion, this indefatigable lover, it was said that he had 640 different girls in under 4 years. This admirable committee man and best mixer had realized quite suddenly that sport, women, communal activities were only, so far as he was concerned, second bests. Really, and at the bottom, he was interested in something else. But in what? In what? That was the problem which Bernard had come to discuss with him, or rather, since it was always Helmholtz who did all the talking, to listen to his friend discussing, yet once more. 3 charming girls from the Bureau of Propaganda by synthetic voice waylaid him as he stepped out of the lift. "Oh, Helmholtz, darling, do come and have a picnic supper with us on Exmoor." They clung round him imploringly. He shook his head. He pushed his way through them. No, we're not inviting any other man. But Helmholtz remained unshaken even by this delightful premise. "No," he repeated, "I'm busy." And he held resolutely on his course. The girls trailed after him. It was not until he had actually climbed into Bernard's plane and slammed the door that they gave up pursuit. Not without reproaches. "These women," he said, as the machine rose into the air. "These women." And he shook his head. He frowned. Too awful. Bernard hypocritically agreed, wishing, as he spoke the words, that he could have as many girls as Helmholtz did, and with as little trouble. He was seized with a sudden urgent need to boast. "I'm taking Lennon a crown to New Mexico with me," he said in a tone as casual as he could make it. "Are you?" said Helmholtz, with a total absence of interest. Then, after a little pause, "This last week or two," he went on, "I've been cutting all my committees and all my girls. You can't imagine what a hullabaloo they've been making about it at the college. Still, it's been worth it, I think. The effects." He hesitated. "Well, they're odd. They're very odd." A physical shortcoming could produce a kind of mental excess. The process, it seemed, was reversible. Mental excess could produce, for its own purposes, the voluntary blindness and deafness of deliberate solitude, the artificial impotence of aestheticism. The rest of the short flight was accomplished in silence. When they had arrived and were comfortably stretched out on the pneumatic sofas in Bernard's room, Helmholtz began again. Speaking very slowly, did you ever feel, he asked, as though you had something inside you that was only waiting for you to give it a chance to come out? Some sort of extra power that you aren't using, you know, like all the water that goes down the falls instead of through the turbines? He looked at Bernard questioningly. You mean all the emotions one might be feeling if things were different? Helmholtz shook his head. Not quite. I'm thinking of a queer feeling I sometimes get. A feeling that I've got something important to say and the power to say it. Only, I don't know what it is, and I can't make any use of the power. If there was some different way of writing, or else something else to write about. He was silent. Then, you see, he went on at last, I'm pretty good at inventing phrases. You know, the sort of words that suddenly make you jump, almost as though you sat on a pin. They seem so new and exciting even though they're about something hypnopatically obvious. But that doesn't seem enough. It's not enough for the phrases to be good. But you make with them ought to be good, too. But your things are good, Helmholtz. Oh, as far as they go. Helmholtz shrugged his shoulders. But they go such a little way. They aren't important enough somehow. I feel I could do something much more important. Yes, and more intense, more violent. But what? What is there more important to say? And how can one be violent about the sort of things one's expected to write about? Words can be like X-rays. If you use them properly, they'll go through anything. You read and you're pierced. That's one of the things I try to teach my students, how to write piercingly. But what on earth's the good of being pierced by an article about a community sting or the latest improvement in scent organs? Besides, can you make words really piercing? You know, like the very hardest X-rays when you're writing about that sort of thing? Can you say something about nothing? That's what it finally boils down to. I try and I try. Hush, said Bernard suddenly and lifted a warning finger. They listened. I believe there's somebody at the door, he whispered. Helmholtz got up, tiptoed across the room, and with a sharp, quick movement, flung the door wide open. There was, of course, nobody there. I'm sorry, said Bernard, feeling and looking uncomfortably foolish. I suppose I've got things on my nerves a bit. When people are suspicious with you, you start being suspicious with them. He passed his hand across his eyes. He sighed. His voice became plaintive. He was justifying himself. If you knew what I'd had to put up with recently, he said almost tearfully, and the uprush of his self-pity was like a fountain suddenly released. If you only knew. Helmholtz Watson listened with a certain sense of discomfort. Poor little Bernard, he said to himself, but at the same time he felt rather ashamed for his friend. He wished Bernard would show a little more pride. Chapter 5. By 8 o'clock, the light was failing. The loudspeakers in the tower of the Stoke Pogues Club house began, in a more than human tenor, to announce the closing of the courses. Lenina and Henry abandoned their game and walked back towards the club. From the grounds of the Internal and External Secretion Trust came the lowing of those thousands of cattle which provided, with their hormones and their milk, the raw materials for the great factory at Farnham Royal. An incessant buzzing of helicopters filled the twilight. Every 2.5 minutes, a bell and the screech of whistles announced the departure of one of the light monorail trains which carried the lower caste golfers back from their separate course to the metropolis. Lenina and Henry climbed into their machine and started off. At 800 feet, Henry slowed down the helicopter screws, and they hung for a minute or two, poised above the fading landscape. The forest of Burnham beaches stretched like a great pool of darkness towards the bright shore of the western sky. Crimson at the horizon, the last of the sunset faded, through orange, upwards into yellow, and a pale watery green. Northwards, beyond and above the trees, the internal and external secretions factory glared with a fierce electric brilliance from every window of its 20 stories. Beneath them lay the buildings of the golf club, the huge lower caste barracks, and, on the other side of a dividing wall, the smaller houses reserved for Alpha and Beta members. The approaches to the monorail station were black with ant-like pullulation of lower caste activity. From under the glass vault, a lighted train shot out into the open. Following its southeasterly course across the dark plain, their eyes were drawn to the majestic buildings of the slow crematorium. For the safety of night-flying planes, its 4 tall chimneys were floodlighted and tipped with crimson danger signals. It was a landmark. Why do the smokestacks have those things like balconies round them? Inquired Lenina. Phosphorus recovery, explained Henry telegraphically. On their way up the chimney, the gases go through 4 separate treatments. P2O5 used to go right out of circulation every time they cremated someone. Now they recover over 98% of it, more than 1.5 kilos per adult corpse, which makes the best part of 400 tons of phosphorus every year from England alone. Henry spoke with a happy pride, rejoicing wholeheartedly in the achievement, as though it had been his own. Fine to think we can go on being socially useful even after we're dead, making plants grow. Lenina, meanwhile, had turned her eyes away and was looking perpendicularly downwards at the monorail station. Fine, she agreed, but queer that alphas and betas won't make any more plants grow more than those nasty little gammas and deltas and epsilons down there. All men are physico-chemically equal, said Henry sententiously. Besides, even epsilons perform indispensable services. Even an epsilon. Lenina suddenly remembered an occasion when, as a little girl at school, she had woken up in the middle of the night and became aware, for the first time, of the whispering that had haunted all her sleeps. She saw again the beam of moonlight, the row of small white beds, heard once more the soft, soft voice that said, and the words there, unforgotten, unforgettable, after so many night-long repetitions, "Everyone works for everyone else. We can't do without anyone. Even epsilons are useful. We couldn't do without epsilons. Everyone works for everyone else. We can't do without anyone." Lenina remembered her first shock of fear and surprise, her speculations through half a wakeful hour, and then, under the influence of those endless repetitions, the gradual soothing of her mind. The soothing, the smoothing, the stealthy creeping of sleep. "I suppose epsilons don't really mind being epsilons," she said out loud. "Of course they don't. How can they? They don't know what it's like to be anything else. We'd mind, of course, but then we've been differentially conditioned. Besides, we start with a different heredity." "I'm glad I'm not an epsilon," said Lenina with conviction. "And if you were an epsilon," said Henry, "your conditioning would have made you no less thankful than you were in a beta or an alpha." He put his forward propeller into gear and headed the machine towards London. Behind them, in the west, the crimson and orange were almost faded. A dark bank of cloud had crept into the zenith. After they flew over the crematorium, the plane shot upwards on the column of hot air rising from the chimneys, only to fall suddenly when it passed into the descending chill beyond. What a marvelous switchback! Lenina laughed delightedly. But Henry's tone was almost, for a moment, melancholy. Do you know what that switchback was? He said. It was some human being finally, indefinitely disappearing, going up in a squirt of hot gas. It would be curious to know who it was. A man or a woman? An alpha or an epsilon? He sighed. Then, in a resolutely cheerful voice, anyhow, he concluded, there's one thing we can be certain of. Whoever he may have been, he was happy when he was alive. Everybody's happy now. Yes, everybody's happy now, echoed Lenina. They had heard the words repeated 150 times every night for 12 years. Landing on the roof of Henry's 40-story apartment house in Westminster, they went straight down to the dining hall. There, in a loud and cheerful company, they ate an excellent meal. Soma was served with the coffee. Lenina took 2 half-gram tablets and Henry 3. At 9:20, they walked across the street to the newly opened Westminster Abbey Cabaret. It was a night almost without clouds, moonless and starry. But of this, on the whole depressing fact, Lenina and Henry were unfortunately unaware. The electric sky signs effectively shut off the outer darkness. Calvin Stopes and his 16 saxophonists. From the facade of the new abbey, the giant letters invitingly glared. London's finest scent and color organ, all the latest synthetic music. They entered. The air seemed hot and somehow breathless, with the scent of ambergris and sandalwood. On the domed ceiling of the hall, the color organ had momentarily painted a tropical sunset. The 16 saxophonists were playing an old favorite. There ain't no bottle in all the world like that dear little bottle of mine. 400 couples were 5-stepping round that polished floor. Lenina and Henry were soon the 401st. The saxophones wailed like melodious cats under the moon, moaned in the alto and tenor registers as though the little death were upon them. Rich with a wealth of harmonies, their tremulous chorus mounted towards a climax, louder and ever louder, until at last, with a wave of his hand, the conductor let loose the final shattering note of ether music and blew the 16 merely human blowers clean out of existence. Thunder in A-flat major. Then, in all but silence, in all but darkness, there followed a gradual detergence, a diminuendo sliding gradually through quarter tones, down to a faintly whispered dominant chord that lingered on, while the 5/4 rhythm still pulsed below, charging the darkened seconds with an intense expectancy. And at last, expectancy was fulfilled. There was a sudden explosive sunrise, and simultaneously, the 16 burst into song. Bottle of mine, it's you I've always wanted. Bottle of mine, why was I ever decanted? Skies are blue inside of you, the weather's always fine. For there ain't no bottle in all the world like that dear little bottle of mine. 5-stepping with the other 400 round and round Westminster Abbey, Lenina and Henry were yet dancing in another world. The warm, the richly colored, the infinitely friendly world of the Soma holiday. How kind, how good-looking, how delightfully amusing everyone was. Bottle of mine, it's you I've always wanted. But Lenina and Henry had what they wanted. They were inside, here and now, safely inside with the fine weather, the perennially blue sky, and when exhausted, the 16 had laid by their saxophones, and the synthetic music apparatus was producing the very latest in slow Malthusian blues. They might have been twin embryos gently rocking together on the waves of a bottled ocean of blood surrogate. Good night, dear friends. Good night, dear friends. The loudspeakers veiled their commands in genial and musical politeness. "Good night, dear friends." Obediently, with all the others, Lenina and Henry left the building. The depressing stars had traveled quite some way across the heavens, but though the separating screen of the sky signs had now to a great extent dissolved, the two young people still retained their happy ignorance of the night. Swallowed half an hour before closing time, that second dose of soma had raised quite an impenetrable wall between the actual universe and their minds. Bottled, they crossed the street. Bottled, they took the lift up to Henry's room on the 28th floor. And yet, bottled as she was, and in spite of that second gram of soma, Lenina did not forget to take all the contraceptive precautions prescribed by the regulations. Years of intensive hypnopaedia and, from 12 to 17, Malthusian drill 3 times a week had made the taking of these precautions almost as automatic as inevitable as blinking. "Oh, and that reminds me," she said as she came back from the bathroom. "Fanny Crown wants to know where you found that lovely green Morocco surrogate cartridge belt you gave me." Alternate Thursdays were Bernard's Solidarity Service days. After an early dinner at the Aphrodisium, to which Helmholtz had recently been elected under Rule 2, he took leave of his friend and, hailing a taxi on the roof, told the man to fly to the Ford Sun Community Singery. The machine rose a couple of 100 meters, then headed eastwards, and as it turned, there before Bernard's eyes, gigantically beautiful, was the Singery. Floodlighted, its 320 meters of white Carrera surrogate gleamed with a snowy incandescence over Ludgate Hill. At each of the 4 corners of its helicopter platform, an immense T shone crimson against the night, and from the mouths of 24 vast golden trumpets rumbled a solemn synthetic music. "Damn, I'm late," Bernard said to himself as he first caught sight of Big Henry, the Singery clock. And sure enough, as he was paying off his cab, Big Henry sounded the hour. "Ford," sang out an immense bass voice from all the golden trumpets. "Ford, Ford, Ford," 9 times. Bernard ran for the lift. The great auditorium for Ford's Day celebrations and other massed community stings was at the bottom of the building. Above it, 100 to each floor, were the 7,000 rooms used by solidarity groups for their fortnightly services. Bernard dropped down to the floor 33, hurried along the corridor, stood hesitating for a moment outside room 3210, then, having wound himself up, opened the door and walked in. Thank Ford, he was not the last. 3 chairs of the 12 arranged round the circular table were still unoccupied. He slipped into the nearest of them as inconspicuously as he could, and prepared to frown at the yet latecomers whenever they should arrive. Turning towards him, "What were you playing this afternoon?" the girl on his left inquired. "Obstacle or electromagnetic?" Bernard looked at her. Ford, it was Morgana Rothschild, and blushingly had to admit that he had been playing neither. Morgana stared at him with astonishment. There was an awkward silence. Then, pointedly, she turned away and addressed herself to the more sporting man on her left. A good beginning for a solidarity service, thought Bernard miserably, and foresaw for himself yet another failure to achieve atonement. If he had only given himself time to look round instead of scuttling for the nearest chair, he could have sat between Fifi Bradlaugh and Joanna Diesel, instead of which he had gone and blindly planted himself next to Morgana. Morgana Ford, those black eyebrows of hers, that eyebrow rather, for they met above the nose. Ford! And on his right was Clara Deterding. True, Clara's eyebrows didn't meet, but she was really too pneumatic. whereas Fifi and Joanna were absolutely right. Plump, blonde, not too large. And it was that great lout, Tom Kawaguchi, who now took the seat between them. The last arrival was Sarojini Engels. "You're late," said the president of the group severely. "Don't let it happen again." Sarojini apologized and slid into her place between Jim Bokanovsky and Herbert Bakunin. The group was now complete, the solidarity circle perfect and without flaw. Man, woman, man, in a ring of endless alternation round the table. 12 of them ready to be made one, waiting to come together, to be fused, to lose their 12 separate identities in a larger being. The president stood up, made the sign of the T, and, switching on the synthetic music, let loose the soft, indefatigable beating of drums and a choir of instruments, near wind and superstring, that plangently repeated and repeated the brief and unescapably haunting melody of the first Solidarity hymn. Again, again. And it was not the ear that heard the pulsing rhythm, it was the midriff. The wail and clang of those recurring harmonies haunted, not the mind, but the yearning bowels of compassion. The president made another sign of the T and sat down. The service had begun. The dedicated Soma tablets were placed in the center of the dinner table. The loving cup of strawberry ice cream Soma was passed from hand to hand, with the formula, "I drink to my annihilation," 12 times quaffed. Then, to the accompaniment of the synthetic orchestra, the first Solidarity hymn was sung. "Forward, we are 12, oh, make us one. Like drops within the social river, oh, make us now together run. As swiftly as thy shining flivver." 12 yearning stanzas, and then the loving cup was passed a second time. "I drink to the greater being," was now the formula. All drank. Tirelessly the music played, the drums beat, the crying and clashing of the harmonies were an obsession in the melted bowels. The second Solidarity hymn was sung. "Come, greater being, social friend, annihilating 12 in one. We long to die, for when we end, our larger life has but begun." Again, 12 stanzas. By this time the Soma had begun to work. Eyes shone, cheeks were flushed, the inner light of universal benevolence broke out on every face in happy, friendly smiles. Even Bernard felt himself a little melted. When Morgana Rothschild turned and beamed at him, he did his best to beam back. But the eyebrow, that black 2-in-1, alas, it was still there. He couldn't ignore it, couldn't, however hard he tried. The melting hadn't gone far enough. Perhaps if he had been sitting down between Fifi and Joanna. For the third time the loving cup went round. "I drink to the imminence of his coming," said Morgana Rothschild, whose turn it happened to be to initiate the circular rite. Her tone was loud, exultant. She drank and passed the cup to Bernard. "I drink to the imminence of his coming," he repeated, with a sincere attempt to feel that the coming was imminent. But the eyebrow continued to haunt him, and the coming, so far as he was concerned, was horribly remote. He drank and handed the cup to Clara Deturting. "It'll be a failure again," he said to himself. "I know it will." But he went on doing his best to beam. The loving cup had made its circuit. Lifting his hand, the president gave a signal. The chorus broke out into the third Solidarity hymn. "Feel how the greater being comes. Rejoice, and in rejoicings die. Melt in the music of the drums, for I am you, and you are I." As verse succeeded verse, the voices thrilled with an ever intenser excitement. The sense of coming's imminence was like an electric tension in the air. The president switched off the music and, with the final note of the final stanza, there was absolute silence. The silence of stretched expectancy, quivering and creeping with a galvanic life. The president reached out his hand, and suddenly a voice, a deep, strong voice, more musical than any merely human voice, richer, warmer, more vibrant with love and yearning and compassion, a wonderful, mysterious, supernatural voice spoke from above their heads. Very slowly, "Oh, Ford, Ford, Ford," it said, diminishingly and on a descending scale. A sensation of warmth radiated thrillingly out from the solar plexus to every extremity of the bodies of those who listened. Tears came into their eyes, their hearts, their bowels seemed to move within them, as though with an independent life. Ford, they were melting. Ford, dissolved, dissolved. Then, in another tone, suddenly, startlingly, "Listen," trumpeted the voice. "Listen." They listened. After a pause, some to a whisper, but a whisper somehow more penetrating than the loudest cry. "The feet of the greater being." It went on and repeated the words, "the feet of the greater being." The whisper almost expired. "The feet of the greater being are on the stairs." And once more there was silence, and the expectancy, momentarily relaxed, was stretched again, taut, almost to the tearing point. The feet of the greater being, oh, they heard them, coming softly down the stairs, coming nearer and nearer down the invisible stairs. The feet of the greater being, and suddenly the tearing point was reached. Her eyes staring, her lips parted, Morgana Rothschild sprang to her feet. "I hear him," she cried. "I hear him." "He's coming," shouted Sarojini Ingalls. "Yes, he's coming. I hear him." Fifi Bradloff and Tom Kawaguchi rose simultaneously to their feet. "Oh, oh, oh," Joanna inarticulately testified. "He's coming," yelled Jim Bokanovsky. The president leaned forward and with a touch released a delirium of cymbals and blown brass, a fever of tom-tomming. "Oh, he's coming," screamed Clara Deterding. "Aye!" And it was as though she was having her throat cut. Feeling that it was time for him to do something, Bernard also jumped up and shouted, "I hear him, he's coming." But it wasn't true. He heard nothing, and for him, nobody was coming. Nobody, in spite of the music, in spite of the mounting excitement. But he waved his arms, he shouted with the best of them, and when the others began to jig and stamp and shuffle, he also jigged and shuffled. Round they went, a circular procession of dancers, each with hands on the hip of the dancer preceding, round and round, shouting in unison, stamping to the rhythm of the music with their feet, beating it out with the hands on the buttocks in front, 12 pairs of hands beating as one, 12 buttocks slabbily resounding, 12 as one, 12 as one. I hear him coming." The music quickened. Faster beat with feet, faster fell the rhythmic hands, and all at once a great synthetic bass boomed out the words which announced the approaching atonement and final consummation of solidarity, the coming of the 12-in-1, the incarnation of the greater being. "Orgy porgy," it sang, while the tom-toms continued to beat their feverish tattoo. "Orgy porgy, forward and fun, kiss the girls and make them one. Boys at one with girls at peace, orgy porgy gives release." Orgy porgy. The dancers caught up the liturgical refrain. "Orgy porgy, forward and fun, kiss the girls And as they sang, the lights began slowly to fade, and at the same time to grow warmer, richer, redder, until at last they were dancing in the crimson twilight of an embryo store. Orgy porgy, in their blood-colored and fatal darkness, the dancers continued for a while to circulate, to beat and beat out the indefatigable rhythm. Orgy porgy. Then the circle wavered, broke, fell in partial disintegration on the ring of couches which surrounded, circle enclosing circle, the table and its planetary chairs. Orgy porgy. Tenderly the deep voice crooned and cooed. In the red twilight it was as though some enormous negro dove were hovering benevolently over the now prone or supine dancers. They were standing on the roof. Big Henry had just sung 11. The night was calm and warm. "Wasn't it wonderful?" said Fifi Bradloff. "Wasn't it simply wonderful?" She looked at Bernard with an expression of rapture, but a rapture in which there was no trace of agitation or excitement, for to be excited is to still be unsatisfied. Hers was the calm ecstasy of achieved consummation, the peace, not of mere vacant satiety and nothingness, but of balanced life, of energies at rest and in equilibrium, a rich and living peace. For the solidarity service had given as well as taken, drawn off only to replenish. She was full, she was made perfect, she was still more than merely herself. "Didn't you think it was wonderful?" she insisted, looking into Bernard's face with those supernaturally shining eyes. "Yes, I thought it was wonderful," he lied and looked away. The sight of her transfigured face was at once an accusation and an ironical reminder of his own separateness. He was miserably isolated now, as he had been when the service began, more isolated by reason of his unreplenished emptiness, his dead satiety, separate and unatoned, while the others were being fused into the greater being, alone even in Morgana's embrace, much more alone, indeed, more hopelessly himself than he had ever been in his life before. He had emerged from that crimson twilight into the common electric glare with a self-consciousness intensified to the pitch of agony. He was utterly miserable, and perhaps, her shining eyes accused him, perhaps it was his own fault. "Quite wonderful," he repeated, but the only thing he could think of was Morgana's eyebrow. And that's the end of chapter 5. I'm going to pause. I'm gonna stop here, and I will resume chapter 6 and on in the next stream. But for now, I want to, talk a little bit about it. If anybody cares, listen, I really kind of need to discuss it because I'm trying to make this a little bit copyright proof. And if I turn it into kind of a fair use or something, then I think I'll be all right. So I'm not claiming that I have necessarily the most insight to give on the story because it is a lot of world building, but we did move on to somewhat of a character development. There's a lot of focus on Bernard feeling, othered in this society. But I wonder if that's how a lot of people feel, and nobody has the guts to actually say it. Everybody just plays along. I mean, he played along. So maybe when you feel such otherness, you're kind of you may be playing an illusion on yourself, and it may be what's happening here. Um, Hard to say. I I'm interested in how horny this book is. For we're examining this extremely advanced society, yet there's quite a lot of emphasis on interpersonal relationships and polygamy, I guess. So that's interesting to me. Um, I truly don't know I barely know the synopsis of this story, so I'm experiencing it prima facie so far. And let's see what else. There's a lot. Well, okay, let's examine the time that this was written. This book is over 90 years old. So the world was a lot different. And yet it's not unimaginable, right? For a distant future that we would still have even as advanced as we might be, there are still so many superficial aspects to society. You know, whether you're an alpha or a gamma or an epsilon, no matter how advanced we wish to idealize our society, we still have all these superficial things, and we still have people who feel otherness, even if you are part of a higher caste like Bernard is. There's still intrinsic internal reasons that you would feel different in a negative way. But alas, there's always those who will get so caught up in the rigmarole of daily interactions with other people, as superficial as they may be, that you don't really have time to think about all that. And I'm trying here. There's not much else to really talk about, I think, with these last 3 chapters. The first 5 in total. So, yeah. All I know is that we're going to head into a more troubling descent into the story, as vaguely as I can put it, because I really don't know what happens in the story. I just know that it progresses into we've started by kind of talking about a utopia, even though it's not quite the most desirable sounding place. It has been described as a utopia, something that has shed all of the archaic, barbaric, cultural, societal norms of the past, and we're heading towards the dystopian aspects of it, even though I think we're already kind of there. So if you have been listening for the story, I will continue on in the next stream. And yeah, if you want to talk about it, I post these on YouTube, and you can leave a comment. I'm always happy to reply and discuss to the best of my abilities, which are limited, but I try my best. So thank you so much for tuning in, for listening, and hopefully you at least got some relaxing value out of it. So until next time, thank you again, and Happy New Year, by the ways. See you in the next VOD or stream. Bye.